If you've followed along for a little bit, you know that I've been trying other MMOs, and one of the bigger MMOs that I have put some time into is, of course, Final Fantasy XIV. I've really been enjoying this game, playing through the base game and then its first expansion, and still continuously working my way through it. There's a lot to unpack. However, I wanted to take a look at my experience with Guild Wars 2 after putting in a bunch of hours into that game, years into that game, and really look at it in a sense of which game, in my opinion, does better compared to the other. Now, this isn't to say that any game is better than another. There are certain perks and, we'll say, advantages each of the games present. However, I wanted to look at it in 5 key areas of what I deem the most important for me being interested into an MMORPG. Now, there's lots of individual layers and you can go super in-depth if you want to. However, I'm going to look at combat, the classes, the story, the leveling experience, and of course, the end game. Out of those 5 areas, let's break it down into a series, talking about each one of these because there's a lot to unpack in each of the episodes. So the first episode, of course, today is going to be talking about the combat in these 2 games, and which game I think does better in regards to that. So go ahead and make sure you like the video, subscribe. I'll include a nice little playlist for it so that everyone can see. So first, let's go ahead and take a look at the combat in Final Fantasy XIV. Now, the combat that I've gotten to, I'm currently level about like 64, 65, so I've been able to go through some of the raids. I've been able to do many different trials. However, I do realize that I don't have the entirety of the toolkit ready to go and unlocked, as I am not level 100, thanks to Dawn Trail having the level cap of level 100. However, I do have a good idea of how the flow of combat will go and what the generalized feeling is. So for Final Fantasy XIV, they have their basic global cooldowns, which you would expect, where essentially you press a button and I think it's like 1.5 seconds. Sometimes it feels like it's 2 seconds, but I'm pretty sure it's 1.5 seconds of in between each individual ability. However, there are certain abilities, and every class that I've experienced thus far has these abilities that can be used off global cooldown, so essentially in an instant. Otherwise, the abilities are put within a specific combo, we'll say, order. So for example, the Dragoon that I'm playing essentially has 2 different pathways that it can go through on its basic rotation. So the basics for the Dragoon is True Thrust, Vorpal Thrust, and then Full Thrust. We'll say that's the basic combo. Now see, in Final Fantasy, each one of the abilities that you use gives the next consecutive ability within that chain a little bit more potency, meaning that it deals more damage, or it has greater effect. Now there's also some capabilities that you could see within that particular toolkit where it could offer a specific buff if you use those abilities within their specific order. Now, there's a lot of different combat potency changes that you can make all the way through. However, the baseline for ability usage is going to be along the combo line and then following it up with global cooldowns at certain points and intervals. So again, for the Dragoon, for example, they have an ability called Dragonfire Dive, which is off of cooldown. So essentially you have these abilities that are back and forth that you can utilize as you are going through any given combat situation. That each one of the roles that you play, so there are the tank roles, there are the melee DPS roles, there are the healers, there are the physical range damage dealers, as well as the magical range damage dealers. Each one of those specific roles has their own unique action that is something that they carry over class from class. For example, if you went from a warrior to a dark knight, you both would have access to the ability called Rampart, which is just a flat damage reduction ability. Now, those specific actions tend to all be off of the global cooldown, so you can use these abilities while you are going through your normal rotation without disruption. However, it is to be said that there usually is a set order of how things should be done and in what order. So for example, popping a DPS cooldown and then using one of your hardest hitting abilities. For example, for the Dragoon again, the Life Surge ability, and then popping it for Final Thrust or Fang and Claw. Both of these will have a greater effect and a guaranteed critical hit. Now that is used off of global cooldown. So again, you have these specific abilities that you can use within their own specific time zones. It becomes kind of an art of when to press these buttons and when you shouldn't. That in a nutshell is Final Fantasy XIV's combat. Now let's go ahead and take a look at Guild Wars 2. Now Guild Wars 2 combat is incredibly customizable and diverse. Given that Guild Wars 2 has many different options of different weapons that they can use with any given class combination, for example, my Elementalist can use the hammer, which came from the Catalyst Elite specialization. Now with the hammer, you are up close and personal, you tend to be a little bit more, we'll say durable as the Elementalist can be, but you tend to have a lot more heavy hitting abilities because you're up close and personal, as compared to if you used the Scepter. You could have identical class and build trait lines for the Elementalist and just use a Scepter and have a vastly different style of gameplay. Now, for example, the Scepter tends to be a medium ranged weapon with lots of spike damage as well as damage over time effects. Elementalist kind of dabbles in both regardless of the weapon that you choose. But with that, you are given a set amount of abilities. You are only given 5 abilities which are tied to your weapons, either one two-handed weapon or a main hand and an offhand weapon, as well as a choice of 5 abilities, 1 heal skill, 1 elite skill, as well as 3 utility skills. That is your combat right there. You choose the build that works best for you given what you are playing in. If you're playing in PvP, it's going to look different than what you would play in, say, a strike mission, or in a raid, or a fractal, or what have you. Now, the combat in Guild Wars 2 tends to be very, very fast, as most of these abilities can be used in quick succession off of a global cooldown very, very fast, and in that regard, it can be a little bit button mashy, especially if we're looking at, say, for example, with the Elementalist that I've been talking about, where you have essentially 5 skills for each of the 4 attunements for your weapons. So that means that you have an upwards of 20 skills that you can use at any given time on top of the other skills that you bring along. So a healing skill, an elite skill, and 3 utility skills. There's a lot that goes into it, and you have all these different options ready to go. Not to mention with Guild Wars 2, there are 2 other features that are included which are just baseline with the game. So one of the big ones is weapon swapping. Now, I talk about my Elementalist being able to swap back and forth through the different elements and all the different abilities that they have. However, with Guild Wars 2, the weapon swapping is something that is featured to every class except for the Elementalist and the Engineer. This means that you'll be able to carry 2 full sets of weapons at any given time and be able to swap back and forth through them freely, albeit on a small 10-second cooldown. Now, given that you can have essentially a ranged setup or a melee setup or double melee setup or what have you, the combinations are crazy, and that just flows into the natural order of combat. And with you being able to press so many buttons so quickly, given the amount of abilities that you have, then being able to swap over to a different weapon and complete that particular combo, that is something that's very, very intense. There's a lot going on with it, and there's a lot of customization that is available. Another key feature that Guild Wars 2 does, which is the dodge roll. Now, the dodge rolls themselves tend to be just more of a defensive maneuver. However, it is something that is ingrained into the game. Every class, save for a few examples, 2 dodge rolls that are available, and these regenerate over time. It fills up the endurance bar, which is in the center of your screen. Now, the endurance bar allows you to dodge roll and evade all abilities, most abilities, for about a second. You time it appropriately, you can dodge nearly everything. Now, granted, there are certain abilities that you can use to regenerate endurance. There's a boon called Vigor, which helps regenerate some of your endurance a little bit faster. Now, between those specific instances, your endurance will regenerate over time. It's just essentially an additional cooldown. And then with that adds an extra level of fluidity with the combat because of all the different buttons that you're pressing, as well as the dodge roll integrated into there. It offers a lot of diversity. There's a lot of capabilities and makes the combat feel so much more intense and more action-oriented in comparison to, say, Final Fantasy XIV, where it is more very structured and rigid. And it should also be mentioned is the use of wells and combos, so combo fields and combo finishers. Now, this is something that's talked about in a couple of panels, as well as if you read through the abilities. Using specific abilities will drop what's called a well or a field, which is a circle that is put around your character. And this allows you to use a combo finisher on it or through it or whatever the finisher is, and that will proc an additional effect. So for example, if my Elementalist uses a fire field and creates a fire circle and I use a slam ability, it will generate extra might for all nearby allies, including myself. Might is a buff that just essentially makes you hit harder. However, there is tons of different combinations that can be utilized at any given time, and these combinations offer a variety of effects, such as stacking extra conditions to deal damage over time, or proccing invisibility, depending on the class. Now, that integrated into it, most of the time you just go through your normal rotation and you don't try to plan through whatever well or field that you have put down and what finisher to use at any given time. Now, having said that, there are some practical uses in, say, World v World or PvP if you are using them strategically. Now, it's also important to know that these two games have two completely different endgame purposes, in my opinion. And that's something that I will cover in the endgame video that I will compare these two later down the road within the next couple of days. Now, I will say in this regard, the combat is very, very closely tied to the classes in both of these games. Final Fantasy has a very structured party outline of how things should be, where the specific classes should be, and how your combat will go. But in that same regard, Guild Wars 2 also does have some structure. It tends to be a lot looser, as the heavy emphasis of boon uptime and your weapon choice can vastly change the combat in any given way. That's also to note that anytime that we talk about combat and what is expected out of a specific class can change drastically with the change of a weapon. And whatever weapon is the flavor of the month or the quarter depends on how the balance of the game is set up. So that is a lot more fluid, bouncing back and forth. However, if we are looking at Final Fantasy is exactly what it is. When you are getting into higher tiered content, it is going to be more along the lines of, this is a very particular dance, and even though the global cooldown may be a little bit slower in comparison to, say, Guild Wars 2, where everything can be, we'll say, spammed or pushed out a lot faster, there is a lot more happening in any given Final Fantasy XIV instance, trial, dungeon, raid. There's a lot of moving parts that are occurring at any given time. That second and a half global cooldown doesn't even really feel all that slow, because there are other buttons to be pressed at any given time, and there's different movement as well as party compositions and boss capabilities. There's a lot of moving parts that kind of balance out that second and a half global cooldown. Now, in comparison to, say, Guild Wars 2, where you can press all the buttons and go as fast as you can, it just is always fast. Every time that I've ever played Guild Wars 2, I have found that the combat has always been one of the best selling features for me, just because there's always a lot of buttons to press. And again, I can talk about this a little bit more as we go into, say, for example, endgames, and we talk about like PvP. Both of those endgame modes, you have to be able to be quick with pressing your buttons, either to avoid a crowd control or to make sure you get all of your damaging off before the boss explodes. There's a lot of moving parts. Now, all in all, I have to give both games credit because their combat does what it is necessary to do for whatever game mode that you are playing. Specifically in this regard, I have to give the edge to Guild Wars 2. Guild Wars 2's combat, in my opinion, is just fast, it is fun, there's a lot going on with it. Now, and of course, it's not to mention that Final Fantasy hasn't been fun and engaging, but I usually attribute the fast and engaging combat tied in with the instances that we are doing, which is more related to the endgame modes, which again, I'll talk to in a couple of videos. However, I will say that the combat in Guild Wars 2 just feels more fluid. It feels more natural. There's so many different options that you have at any given time that it's almost like a quick time decision maker that you can do at any given instance. And of course, with the variety of different skills that you can utilize, paired with the different weapon capabilities, there's just a lot that makes this combat feel so awesome, in my opinion. In my personal opinion, I really, really like the combat compared to Final Fantasy XIV. Before everyone jumps in, as I've already admitted at the beginning of the video, I do not have the complete toolkits locked out for even my highest level class, which is the Dragoon. However, I believe I've gotten a good enough taste of what the combat is like in Final Fantasy XIV to make an accurate assessment, despite me missing about 5 or 6 different skills. I must say, however, in Final Fantasy XIV, when you pull off the combos appropriately and you follow through and do what you need to, it is a very satisfying feeling. Now, tomorrow's video, I will go ahead and talk about the classes, because I feel like that is something very, very important that should be discussed, because that's one of the major drawing features for this game. If you are interested in learning more about Guild Wars 2, Janthier Wilds is coming out, which is its newest expansion. And you can see all the things that I'm excited about if you click this video here. Otherwise, stay caffeinated, folks.